seminar for security and international relations. Aidan here, who normally would be running the event, has had to go abroad to do an interview for the university.
Durham, that's abroad.
Durham, is it Durham? Okay, somewhere. Somewhere anyway. So I have the pleasure of introducing Toby Dodge to you from the London School of Economics. And he's going to be talking about intervention and dreams of exogenous state building, the applications of liberal peace in Afghanistan and Iraq. Probably talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. Sounds good. So, without any more ado, over to Toby.
Well, thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here, and with the camera rolling, it's almost like self-criticism of the comrade Chandler teasing out my past sins of academic abuse or whatever. But and I'm not sure if this measures up to a paper, but it's certainly a few thoughts on a conundrum. So I think in both Afghanistan and Iraq, the US-led invasion began as a military operation designed to remove two so-called rogue regimes and replace them with ruling elites that were less autonomous and more aligned with the goals of the United States foreign policy. But I think what interests me in both cases, Washington's initial vision for the operation was specifically and consciously designed to be the antithesis of liberal peace building. It was meant to involve a short, sharp intervention, a quick decapitation driven by the US's military dominance married with a quick exit. So I could term this, I suppose, laissez-faire regime change. This, however, soon fell foul of indigenous realities, with what the interveners encountered once they'd secured control, or what they thought was control, over Kabul and Baghdad. So in terms of time on the ground and money spent, the exogenous presence in Afghanistan and Iraq makes them the largest and I think the most ambitious interventions of the 21st century. So Kabul fell to coalition forces in November 2001, and if the highly ambitious transition plans agreed to by NATO in 2010 go according to plan, the Afghan government will finally be wholly responsible for the provision of order across the country by December 2014. So over the 14 years of the occupation, money spent on relief and reconstruction by the US in Afghanistan stands at a dizzying $89 billion. In addition, there's a further $8 billion being spent by various international donors, channeled through a series of multinational trust funds. By comparison, Baghdad fell to a US-led coalition in April 2003, and as we know, US troops were finally withdrawn from the country over 8 years later in December 2011. Over nearly 9 years, $213 billion was spent, with $61 billion of that coming directly from the US Treasury. So what I'm interested in here, I suppose, is the shifting from the first visions that drove the US into Afghanistan and Iraq of a neoliberal, laissez-faire intervention and quick removal of the regime and then out. However, once that played out, what I want to argue is the US, the UN and NATO, when faced with what they perceived to be state collapse, rising violence and a complex stabilization effort, deployed the international model available, liberal peace building, in a long-winded and very expensive attempt to extricate themselves from the increasing quagmire they faced. So what I want to place on the table is two very different models of intervention. A neoliberal laissez-faire intervention using American power and then dependent on the supposed transformative effects of the international market and individual rationality, juxtaposed against something much more costly and much more long-running, a liberal peace-building model which then drew the US into spending vast amounts of blood and treasure in reconvening, reconstructing the Afghan and the Iraqi state. And I would argue at the end, if I've got time, in failing to do this. Now, counter to the case I'm going to try and make, stating that what the Americans were up to in Iraq and Afghanistan as liberal peace building is somewhat controversial, to say the least. Roland Paris, Timothy Sisk, and Edward Newman argue that because the initial interventions in both Iraq and Afghanistan were not responses to civil war or imposing a peace settlement or were not triggered for requests from inside the country, they, quote, are profoundly different from most state-building operations. If anything, they would argue that Iraq is even a greater aberration than Afghanistan, firstly because the human rights abuses under the Ba'ath regime were not grave enough in 2003, as opposed to 1989 or 1991, to trigger an intervention. And the second reason to rule out Iraq out of the liberal peace debate is the humanitarian rhetoric used by Bush and Blair. This, according to Thomas Weiss, another academic proponent of liberal peace building, was a convenient sleight of hand to hide more nefarious interests. Now, to add insult to injury, Weiss is very angry in this latest book that he's written on Afghanistan and Iraq being rolled into the liberal peace, because clearly the deployment of Iraq as a case study has made liberal peace building guilty by association with much more muscular attempts at American imperialism. However, what I want to argue is the power of the liberal peace-building discourse meant that once the United States were confronted with a much greater task, a much larger, more expensive, more violent set of social actors in Iraq and Afghanistan, they had no choice but to deploy the liberal peace-building measure, liberal peace-building approach. So the next section of the talk is called Thinking About Liberalism and Liberal Peace-Building. I want to see if I can, especially with David at the table, to draw a distinction between liberalism per se and liberal peace-building, and then deploy a kind of neoliberal approach to the first stages of the occupation, and then this liberal peace-building to the second. So neoliberalism is a dominant paradigm, a discourse for understanding state and society and seeking to reform it, is organised around four major categories or units of analysis: the individual, the market, the state and democracy. But I think certainly the individual, the market and the state are given very narrow and very specific roles. For liberals, the individual is the dominant sovereign category of analysis, and as such is imbued with a universal and, I would argue, uncomplicated rationale. This leads to the second category, the kind of all-powerful causative role of the market. The market is the main arena where rational individuals interact together for their mutual benefit, but I think more importantly, unfettered markets, both at a national and a global level, are the only coherent mechanism for creating and distributing wealth, and as Barry Hindness argues, creating or at least disciplining individuals, teaching them prudence, diligence, punctuality and self-control. Now, I think the central ideational tension within liberalism is the state, and this is, I think, the big theme of the difference between liberalism and a much more active, or neoliberalism and a much more active liberal, much more aggressive liberal peace building. On the one hand, the spectre that haunts the neoliberal vision of the rational individual in coming into a market equilibrium, of course, is the state. For liberalism, the power of the state and the potential for it to be abused is the main threat to individuals interacting in an unfettered market. Therefore, the state has to be constrained, forced outside the market, and bounded not to interfere too much with individual free will. Minimizing the role of the state and maximizing the influence of individual liberty is the ultimate guarantee is ultimately guaranteed by the fourth and final neoliberal category, democracy. However, of course, within liberal peace building, the state has dual pathologies. One, of course, is the despotic threat of its abuse of its power to constrain the market and the individual, but the second is its chronic weakness. And I think with the rise of liberal peace building subsuming and taking over from neoliberalism, it's the chronic weakness of the state that comes central. So given the choice, neoliberals see populations everywhere as opting for a liberal system with a democratic structure, empowering the market and the individual and constraining the state. Against this background, how do we understand the rise of liberal peace building? At the end of the Cold War, if the end of the Cold War created a space for a new norm of liberal interventionism, its arrival was heralded in '91 by the Gulf War. Operation Provide Comfort in '91, in the aftermath of the Gulf War, backed up by the apparently stunning battlefield dominance of the US during the war itself, gained UN Security Council backing for the suspension of Iraq's sovereignty to provide humanitarian relief and protection for the Kurdish population in the north of the country. So Iraq was the testing ground for the initial rise of liberal peace building, sanctioned by the UN in the interregnum between the end of the Cold War and the rise of critical constraining voices, Russia and China, in the turn of the century. So we have Somalia in 92-93, Haiti 94, Bosnia 93-95, East Timor 99, and Sierra Leone 2000-2001. Throughout the 1990s, the Security Council consistently reduced its interpretation of the level of threat to international peace and security needed to authorise intrusive interventions into sovereign territory. This muscular humanitarianism reached its height with a series of lectures given by Kofi Annan and the report of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. If the first generation of international interventions had been centred on conflict mediation, second generation on conflict resolution, this third generation of intervention in the 1990s perfected this model of liberal peace building. This new peace-building doctrine gave ideational and instrumental coherence by its intervention of the main causes driving humanitarian suffering, and that was the abuse or the failure of the state. So the state becomes placed front and central as the main pathology for liberal peace building to solve. So what I think I have is two different models of the pathology of liberal intervention. The first is driven by removing, almost a Benthamite focus on removing the state and letting rational individualism and the markets deliver post-state harmony, as it were. The second identifies the root cause of conflict, not as the despotic state, but as the weak or malfunctioning state that needs to be rebuilt to constrain or to deliver order. Now, I think this liberal peace building becomes codified through the 90s by a myriad of actors, a whole of government approach, RAND, the Institute for State Effectiveness, commercializing and selling interventionism. And what we're left with, I think, in 2000 and thereabouts is what Tony Smith, to quote him, says, is this template for intervention that gives scant attention to internal forces, concluding instead that the primary variables for success are the abundant supply of foreign troops or other material resources, combined with a political will from Washington to commit to the long term to transforming these states. So what I'm trying to put on the table are two different models of understanding how post-intervention works. One, laissez-faire and minimal. The other, the whole of government approach, liberal peace building. So the move from neoliberalism to neoliberal peace building. Now, intriguingly, until 2003, George W. Bush's foreign policy team were set expressly against any commitment to liberal peace building. In the presidential election campaign of 2000, candidate Bush sought to distinguish himself from the Clinton presidency by arguing that there be no foreign policy as social work, no extended forays into other countries in an attempt to restructure their politics. The universality of self-creating markets with rational individuals at their centre appeared to be the guiding liberal units shaping George W. Bush's foreign policy. This ideological aversion of the Bush administration to nation building remained intact through the initial invasion, through the initial policy planning for both the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. If we look at Afghanistan and the planning for the invasion of Afghanistan, the policy objectives were shaped by the president's aversion to liberal peace building. In the National Security Council meetings that structured the planning process, the working assumption was that US troops would be withdrawn as soon as possible. The Bush administration's approach to Afghanistan was juxtaposed against Clinton's policy to Bosnia and to Kosovo. Now, to quote Undersecretary of Defensive Policy Douglas Feith, effectively, Feith argues that Clinton effectively turned Bosnia and Kosovo into long-term wards of the international community. We did not want to do that with the Afghans. We did not want to make the Afghans think that we intended to take the same approach. On the ground in Afghanistan from November 2001 to June 2003, this antipathy towards the liberal peace building led US to deploy a minimum amount of troops. In December 2001, there were only 1,300 US troops in the country. It's for the first 4 months of its existence, from December 2001 to March 2002, Karzai's provisional government had no budget to pay civil servants and no police officers, or no budget to pay police officers. As late as April 2003, to quote Rumsfeld, the last thing you're going to hear from this podium is someone thinking that they know how Afghanistan ought to organize itself. They're going to have to figure it out. They're going to have to grab a hold of that thing and do something. We're there to help, but we're not there to rule. Now, this minimalist approach, for possibly a different set of reasons to governing Afghanistan, was supported by the policy of the United Nations Special Representative in Kabul, Lakhdar Brahimi. He argued that a heavy international presence in the country was neither possible nor desirable. And we see that with Ashraf Ghani and his approach to rebuilding the Ministry of Finance. He was pioneering international companies to subcontract the procurement and auditing. The Crown agents based in the UK and KPMG had central roles in the initial rebuilding of the Ministry of Finance. To quote Ashraf Ghani, the strategy resembled an international market model of state administration, and as such was consistent with the broader goals of reconstruction and development. In Iraq after 2003, a similar dynamic, the initial rejection of liberal peace building, is identifiable. In February 2003, Rumsfeld laid out the administration's antipathy to liberal peace building in a set-piece speech in New York, indicatively titled Beyond Nation Building. With the, quote, success of US policy in Afghanistan in mind and looking forward to the invasion of Iraq, he decried the detrimental effects of long-term foreign presence in any country. For Rumsfeld, this was, quote, unnatural, hindering the individual of the autonomy and the reform of the country's economy, dragging it towards a market system. As with Afghanistan, this antipathy towards liberal peace building was the first working model of the Bush administration in Iraq. This approach was outlined in a policy document, Iraq's Goals and Objectives and Strategy, circulated amongst the principals in August 2002. It stated, the United States preserves but reforms and shrinks the current Iraqi bureaucracy, reforms the Iraqi military and security institutions. To quote Condoleezza Rice, then the National Security Advisor, the concept was that we would defeat the army, but the institutions would hold. Everything from the ministers to the police force. You'd be able to bring in a new leadership, but the body would stay in place, end of quote. So Paul Bremer arrives in Iraq in May 2003 with complete executive power to impose this model of neoliberal peace building. We can run through it, but the first thing he does is ban the top 4 levels of the Ba'ath Party from holding any government jobs, in effect driving the senior management out of the street, out of the state. Basically, Fife told Bremer that he needs to implement this policy even if it causes administrative incoherence. The head of the CIA in Baghdad at the time estimated that it drove 50,000 Baathists underground overnight. He then goes on to disband the 400,000 strong army, and then even though as he was flying over Baghdad on his way from the airport to the Republican Palace, which became his HQ, he says, no one understood, I didn't understand how broken this country actually was. When Rumsfeld was confronted with the widespread looting that greeted the arrival of US troops in Baghdad, he says succinctly, freedom's untidy and free people are there to make free people are free to make mistakes. They're also free to live their lives and do wonderful things. That's what's happening here. So the argument here is that in both Afghanistan and Iraq, what the Bush administration is doing is violently imposing a neoliberal analytical category, shrinking the state, breaking the state's coercive capacity, disbanding the Iraqi army, unleashing what they believe is the free market and individual rationality to rework the state. And you can see the roots of this in the national security strategy of the United States, published before the invasion of Iraq. Basically, what's happening is the market and rational individualism is being unleashed to restructure the state at the cheapest possible. And as soon as the Taliban and the Baathists are defeated, the Department of Defense under Rumsfeld starts cutting troops and withdrawing them in the hope that Iraq and Afghanistan will be reformed by the market. Unsurprisingly, this approach is rapidly curtailed by the explosion of anti-US, anti-reformist violence in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, the effect of this in 2004 is the setting up of the Multinational Security Transition Command, which sets about empowering the US military to spend $5.7 billion to train 270,000 Iraqi troops and paramilitary police, allegedly by the summer of 2006. By 2011, $24.5 billion have been spent rebuilding the Iraqi armed forces. By January 2012, the Iraqi security forces now employ roughly 100,000 people spread between the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of the Interior, and the Prime Minister's counterterrorism force. Famously, in January 2007, George W. Bush declares the surge and the civilian surge, and basically commits the United States to reconstituting a very muscular Iraqi army, but also, much more intriguingly, reconstituting the Iraqi civilian institutions of the state, attempting to drive them back into society, discipline the population, and impose counter-insurgency doctrine led by the very newsworthy David Petraeus at the moment. If you look at what counterinsurgency doctrine is, and to quote David Galula, the high priest of counterinsurgency, it's recreating a machine for disciplining the population. Statistics would suggest that since 2005, the number of people employed by the Iraqi state has risen to 2.3 million, which is roughly the same 31% of the labour force compared to 35% of the labour force under the Baathists. Basically, what's happened is the US state has jettisoned its neoliberal ambitions, jettisoned its faith in the market for reconstructing the Iraqi state, or reconstructing Iraq along neoliberal lines, and involved itself in a very muscular attempt at neoliberal peace building, reconstructing an omnipresent state in order to screw the population down and discipline them. A similar process can be identified, if less successfully, from June 2003 in Afghanistan. When confronted with rising levels of violence, Khalilzad, the newly appointed ambassador to Afghanistan, puts in place the Accelerating Success Plan, which ramps up the money spent reconstituting the Afghan security services and reconstituting the Afghan state. US spending in Afghanistan doubled from $740 million in 2003 to $1.9 billion in 2004. Again, broadly comparable to Iraq, what both the UN mission and ISAF embarked on, and NATO in Afghanistan, is liberal peace building. In 2001, the Afghan UN mission initially only employed 75 international staff and had a budget of 43 million. In 2008, the budget was 86 million and grew to 168 million in 2009 and 250 million in 2010. UNAMA now employs 1,500 people. The new policy initiative was added to in June 2011, when this time President Obama announced the application of aggressive counterinsurgency campaign, both a military surge and a civilian surge, rebuilding the Afghan state through to 2012. if we can compare what these strategies of muscular, aggressive, liberal peace building have delivered in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think in Afghanistan we have a hugely overdeveloped security services, which is a massive drain on state resources. It is seeking, possibly with success, we don't know yet, to dominate Afghan society. The Afghan institutions of the civilian state are incredibly impoverished, cannot deliver meaningful service delivery to the population in a very similar way to Iraq. So we have hugely overdeveloped despotic power and massively impoverished infrastructural power. It's almost like a neoliberal nightmare. The markets aren't functioning. The state is anchored into despotic power and patronage, not ideology or delivery of civilian services. What are my conclusions? What I would suggest is through the 90s, through trial and error, the Bush administration, and I think probably the Obama administration, and to a large extent the United Nations, lost faith in neoliberalism, lost faith in the power of the market, and shifted to a much more interventionist, much more muscular approach to disciplining rogue populations, not rogue states, by rebuilding the coercive institutions of the state and by investing promise in the exogenous creation of indigenous civilian institutions as well. That they failed at. What they've been roughly successful at is recreating indigenous despotic power, as seen in Iraq and possibly, I think, too early to tell, but probably seen in Afghanistan, creating a new type of state, highly or possibly quite a familiar post-colonial or neo-colonial state, strongly despotic, strongly present in a violent way in society. And I think this is indicative of a crisis of confidence in neoliberalism and a crisis of confidence in the market and actually in the universal individual subject. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So there's quite a lot of interesting stuff there. And so if you say who you are, because we don't all know each other, and I'll take probably a couple of questions or comments. Paul. Speak up, Lou.
Okay, cool. In your opinion, what has changed after this turn in Iraq and Afghanistan? How this move towards a more muscular approach towards state building, how this move is different from the shift that there was in the 90s also, from the beginning of the 90s until the interventions in, say, Bosnia and Kosovo, which were also muscular and ambitious.
Okay. Jessica and then Jamie, and we'll see where we are.
I have sort of two questions, I think, because correct me if I understood you wrong. So you were saying the initial approach was this neoliberal approach, which then sort of, through the necessities of the logic on the ground, slipped into the liberal peace-building approach. Now, at the same time, so I was wondering when you said this was sort of the only available alternative. Now, I was wondering, for the Americans, I was wondering, is that the only available alternative for the Americans or the only available alternative for you to interpret these things? Because you seem to create the scenario of this despotic state and the police state, disciplinary state, dominating the society, and I was wondering what's that to do with liberal peace building? And secondly, when you said liberal peace building is sort of a mechanism that deals with the pathologies of the state, that's sort of what you said initially, and then you said, well, the initial approach was let the market and the rational individualism unfold, and then that crumbled and went into we saw a lot of anti-American violence, so it looks as if it wasn't the pathologies of the state, but the pathologies of the subject and the individual that wasn't exactly working according to this neoliberal agenda. So I was wondering, is it the pathologies of the state that peace building addresses, or the pathologies of the subject that's actually not rational or liberal? Or
So, because the first question is quite fundamental, maybe you'd like a chance to come back.
Excellent. I'll do.
I've basically got the same questions in a way, so I don't know.
So wouldn't it be better to see how Toby deals with them and then you and Dibyesh?
Excellent. Right, I'll deal with the second set first because I think that's interesting. And I'd partly say exactly that the international or the US loses faith in the rational individual. So if you look at that quote from Rumsfeld, the wonderful quote from Rumsfeld in 2003, freedom's messy. They're revolting, and across the discourse of the US, yes, they're taking the US administration at the time, yes, they're taking things home from the state, good luck to them. They're dismantling the state. And then, of course, that mutates into a violent attack on the US and a violent insurgency trying to drive away the structures that the US wanted to set up in the aftermath. So I wouldn't disagree with you there. And that then enforces upon them a much more the need to build a much more omnipresent despotic state. Now, if you look at what neoliberalism is seeking to do is put its faith in the market to discipline, or to use their own language, to liberate the individual. I would argue the obsession of liberal peace building is to reconstruct a stronger state, to impose order on the population. So the distinction, I suspect, is from the rational individual being liberated to the population being disciplined. So you could see, as you were alluding to, liberal peace building being much more akin to counterinsurgency doctrine, to building a state that imposes order as opposed to shrinking a state that liberates individuals. I think that's how I'd answer your question. On the example of Bosnia and Kosovo, and I realise who I'm sitting next to, my hunch would be that if you look at the different interventions through the 90s, the defining factor that sets them apart is the capacity of the existing institutions. Somalia ends in disaster, no institutions. Haiti, very weak institutions. East Timor, weak institutions. Sierra Leone, better. And Bosnia, I think, stronger institutions. So the template that was being set up, extrapolating from the supposed successes of Bosnia and to a lesser extent Sierra Leone, is based actually on capitalising on and exploiting the institutional capacity. I think where it comes up against weak institutions, Haiti especially and Somalia, it fails and they leave. So what's the alternative? To answer the second question again, is flee. You could argue that in Afghanistan and Iraq the stakes were much higher for the United States, and although the policy debates were about, certainly in Iraq, about leaving, cutting and running, there was the Iraq Study Group, the congressionally mandated report, and indeed the Democrats in both houses basically said cut and run and leave. Bush felt that was impossible, and so what he set about doing is recreating this muscular state.
And what about the point about the alternatives? That you said that liberal was the only alternative to the non-liberal.
Well, I think the alternative in the discourse is to simply leave and let the state fail, which is exactly what happened in Somalia and to a lesser extent in Haiti, as I understand it.
Okay, so I've got quite a few. So Jamie and then Divya, Paulina, and then Sue. I've got you guys. Good. So Jamie, yes.
Yeah, no, thanks. Great, interesting stuff. Well, the first one is actually a small thing, which is how does the turn towards the use of drones and kind of surveillance occupation affect the argument, which, you know, is perhaps a separate paper, but I was just interested. And secondly, on I think the kind of crucial things raised by Jessica, doesn't the experience in Iraq and Afghanistan actually reveal a contradiction within liberalism and undermine the idea that the disciplinary state on the one hand and the kind of liberating rational subject on the other are two sides of the same coin, because the individual universal subject is not a naturally given thing, something that had to be created forcefully by the state and recreated all the time. So there's always this fantasy almost of just being able to allow the rational individual to flourish, and then having to discipline people into being the kind of rational individuals that they want.
Right, so... Yes? Good. Right.
No, hold on a second. Sorry. Hold your thought though. Yeah, Divya.
Yeah, very quick. Could you expand? I'm confused about your use of word muscular, because what can be more muscular than invading a country and bombing it? I mean, you keep using the word muscular for somehow something that's not as violent as what happened in the beginning. So your juxtaposition of neoliberal, let's people free kind of thing of early Bush vis-a-vis later Bush does not seem to take into account that the earlier form was war making, the other form was where people started resisting, right? And second is, in terms of, I was intrigued by the question of why it changed. Why did it change? And you seem to say that it changed because there was a violent insurgency. In the end, again, the blame goes back to the natives that because they were resisting violently, the poor Americans in one sense had very little option but to transform. I'm just trying, but is that what you're saying?
Point. And on those two, because we've got at least another 6 people. But we're just going to take one more question, then you can come back. Pauline.
Okay, my question is, I'm happy to go along with the shape you described, but I'm a bit perplexed by the content you give to this shape, because I was wondering how about democracy? And you kind of, because democracy is a key term when you bring in the market, or liberal peace, and neoliberalism. So I was wondering whether the shift you described is from democracy to order, rather than from the rational individual to a different approach.
Right. Jamie, if you look at the discursive understanding, the ideation understanding of the key thinkers in the Bush presidency, and that would be Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Bush, intriguingly to himself, not Rice, so the kind of more, the ideological entrepreneurs. I can, historically, as a historical sociologist, completely agree with the argument that the individual is created through disciplinary mechanisms of modernity in the state. They wouldn't. And so the distinction there is between the geotemporal history of Europe, as you would understand it, and the ideological vision of universal liberalism as they would understand it. That's the distinction I'm getting at. And I think that the distinction then evolves, their understanding of what's going on is then tempered by violence. I think that would be my answer to that. So yes, it's a clear, I think it's also a tension. If you look at liberal thought in 19th century Europe, you see that tension between the need to liberate individuals and let them be rational, and the need to discipline them. And that's I think it's a tension within liberal philosophy. On the drones, I haven't thought carefully about it, but I would have thought, and we see this in Syria now, that US expeditionary warfare is simply off the agenda for a decade, a generation. And as a US president, what Obama's trying to do is to find a way around that. So you can't go into the federal administrative territories or the Northwest Provinces and kill people. So you do it remotely and hang the cost. It doesn't really matter. So you're creating violent resentment, but you can do it from 2,000 feet. It's very much, as you know, about like British imperialism after 1920 in Iraq, where you do it from aeroplanes and armed cars because you haven't got the money to do it intensely on the ground. So that's the first thing. On Depesh's point, it's the native is the subject of the intervention, and the discourse shifts when the native, unsurprisingly, isn't happy to be liberated. So if you look at all the justification for the invasion of Iraq, less so, but still very strong in Afghanistan, you're not, shock and awe isn't deployed against Iraqis or Afghans. It's deployed against those who are suppressing them. So and within neoliberal rhetoric, you divide the unrepresentative leadership, ruling elite from the population. You do that as early as the 80s with the Washington Consensus, the good governance approach. And so, yes, your point is, I completely take the initial regime change is horrifically violent, but isn't explained as such. The aftermath, then the great shock, and I think it was a shock by the Bush administration. You see in memoirs, in testimonies, in newspaper interviews, when you see Paul Wolfowitz in 2002 and 2003 testify before Congress, Iraqis are the most pro-American people in the Middle East, the Iraqis. Afghans will be happy to be liberated. And the whole military campaign beyond the bombing is with that in mind. And the CIA, bless them, ship in tons of American flags, so by the time the mainstream military gets to Baghdad, the Baghdadis can wave them. Now, after liberation, after the initial looting, you have a violent and broadly popular and populist revolt. Then the discourse changes. It goes from dead-enders to Islamists, and bless him, Tony Blair in his second testimony before the Iraq inquiry is still peddling this line. It isn't Iraqis that are killing us, it's nasty people from someone else did it. So even now, the native isn't to blame. The native cannot be irrational, although the ramifications of the policy, the building of a muscular disciplinary state, clearly leads to that point. Democracy. Interesting. If you think about what was set up in Afghanistan, much more so than in Iraq, I think, is what could be described as a low-intensity democracy, or in fact, it's an incredibly centralised presidential system where Karzai is responsible for not only appointing the cabinet right down to sub-provincial civil servants. It's one state. So you could argue a bit much more conspiratorially or instrumentally in Afghanistan that the system is set up where you appoint one individual collaborating elite, or the pinnacle of the collaborating elite, and you work through them. I think in Afghanistan, in Iraq, it's more messy, and I think the faith in democracy, or in a form of democracy, was evolved. So to begin with, you had a plan that would give Iraq back to unrepresentative formal exiled Iraqis aligned to the neoconservatives. When it was realised that wouldn't work, you then have 2 years from the spring of 2003 to the spring of January of 2005 before you organise elections. So you're shaping a system in as much as you need elections because of the zeitgeist and justification, but you're shaping the ground that you get a low intensity democracy where you're actually through the division of Iraq, at the primordialisation of Iraq, you divide Iraq in a way that you get the result you want, you empower the leadership you want. So I don't think it is a move from from liberalism to democracy. I think it's a move. It's a move. Yeah, it's a move. It's a slow recognition that the people you're liberating aren't rational individuals like you are. They're pretty pissed off that you bombed them, and they're going to fight to drive you out.
Yeah, so you first, and then me.
Well, thank you for the conference. It was quite interesting, all the terms that you used. However, I was wondering, what is the importance of the role of discourse for perpetuating this idea that the best model of democracy and of liberalism to work is the one dictated by the United States? Because actually there were some of the immediate regional neighbors of the US that did not support intervention on Iraq. So, in your perspective, do you think that the role of the discourse is more relevant than the solution itself?
Yeah.
My question is a little bit of an extension of Maria's. I wanted to talk about the nature of these democracies that they create and the resulting political affiliations with other nations. And what we've seen after the Arab Spring, after the liberation of Iraq, Afghanistan, and maybe if we look at Palestine, when they've had democratic elections, they don't always favour the Americans.
Hardly ever.
Hardly ever. And so how does this affect the legitimacy of their intervention to provide a liberal democracy that's designed to be favourable to their interests?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
I have two
You three are definitely next.
yeah, I have two conceptions, which is I feel is just like urban theories of imposing these conceptions, just like the sentence or the conception that you said here, the discipline, the population thesis, just like imposing the values of other nations over other nations, saying this is a discipline. What is the measurement of disciplines? And the other thing is the intervention in Iraq is here. All the their theory, which you telling about, is saying is liberating, and on the other side is saying colonizing Iraq. So which one is adopted or which one is the right one?
And also, what's better, liberal peace or neoliberalism?
Let's say neither.
Well, just say whatever. So, yeah, you come back and then there'll be many more questions.
Right, to answer the first question, yeah, my analysis is unashamedly ideational. That basically what I'm seeking to understand is the discursive vision that shaped policy in the run-up to Afghanistan and Iraq, then when how being confronted with a very violent reality, then policy changed. That's it in a nutshell. So what I'm seeking to identify, let me go back a bit. The period after the attacks on 9/11, especially in the run-up to in 2002 and 2003, is absolutely amazing. Not only did the United States know little or nothing about Afghanistan, they deliberately didn't gather information and knowledge on Iraq. There was such a strong and powerful sense of a universal vision driving that we don't have to know, because when we get there, we'll be welcomed. We have a kind of causative mechanism which will liberate these people, and then we'll go and they'll live happily ever after. And you can see that's somewhat of a cliched rendition. You can go, especially to Paul Wolfowicz's congressional testimonies. There's a very strong sense of that, and it's, I mean, the neoconservatives and the Bush presidency are kind of gift for political scientists of a kind of ideational bent, because it's there and it's strong and it's guiding, and I think it's causative. I can, well, nearly all my work makes that point. So, and the kind of instrumental. Sitting in Baghdad in May 2003 as the city was being shredded and burnt to the ground, and these gentlemen I was sitting with see Eastern Gate of, or whatever it is, Western Gate of the Arab world. Bush couldn't stand the power. I said, Iraq was on its knees. Saddam Hussein would have given his oil to the United States. There was no instrumental reason for this. And we see with Exxon now leaving Iraq, the multinational oil companies, American-based multinational oil companies, have done very poorly out of it. In that sense, I think it's clear that, I would say this, but I think the ideational arguments are clearly persuasive in that sense. Which leads us to the second question, if I can read my notes, which is about the nature of the democracy created. Exogenously created democracy strikes me as you know, it's a kind of shortcut, isn't it? Like junk food or wrapping yourself in cellophane to lose weight, which, trust me, doesn't work. But in that sense, you know, again, it was this high point of ideological hubris you can trace from 1989 and kind of Fukuyama's work, and that kind of the rise of that particular brand of neoconservatives. Intriguing and quite fascinating, neoconservatives under Reagan especially, and in their earlier incarnations, were wrestling with the damaging effects of liberalism and modernity, and were trying to find a way of unifying American popular opinion. Had very little to say, and when they did about exogenous, about foreign policy, and you have a slow transformation, I think led by Wolfowitz, and indeed his experiences in a democratizing Indonesia, which he draws the wrong lessons from. And then you get to the point about the spring. Well, Iraq is an aberration in the spring for a series of reasons. Firstly, it's militantly and effectively and efficiently heading back to dictatorship. Nur al-Maliki has clear authoritarian ambitions and is using the judiciary, the military, the police and the Secret Service to realise those, and is doing so fairly effectively. Iraqi society, because of the violence it went through in the aftermath of regime change, it's shredded and fractured in a way that civil society is finding it extremely difficult to mobilise against that. So the direct outcome of exogenous regime change in an attempt to build a low-intensity democracy is a return, I would venture, to authoritarianism. I think that probably answers that. And of course, it's a great irony, if we don't believe in conspiracies, that exogenous intervention has brought that. I think just so there's no confusion, I thought the invasion of Iraq and regime change was an obscenity, and a lot of Iraqis that I knew were killed in that, but more importantly, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi died because of neo-imperialist arrogance, but more intriguingly, I suspect, American incompetence in the aftermath of the war. I don't. The arguments around neo-colonialism and imperialism, the argument I'm trying to make at the start of the paper is that the vision that the US had for post-invasion Iraq and Afghanistan, if it was imperial, it was the imperialism of a universal market that was going to deliver what they thought a liberated population would do. It then became much more interventionist in a reconstruction of a state that they demanded would be aligned to the US to deliver foreign policy outcomes. They wanted firstly not a defeat, but then a state aligned to the United States and a new governing elite. Of course, the great irony, as we're seeing now with the Iraqi government's role in breaking Iranian sanctions and supporting the Ba'athist regime in Damascus, is the government is aligned to Iran, and I think has taken a pragmatic alignment to Damascus, which is directly at odds with what the US wanted and under the US policy at the moment, I suspect.
Tell us a bit more about normatively. Are you pleased that neoliberalism has been defeated? Because normally people on the left think that neoliberalism is much worse than other sorts of liberalism.
I'm not on the left, David.
I'm just saying. The audience You're just saying it's just a different way.
I think it's two different forms of cultural hubris. And I actually think the arguments around R2P and a kind of a liberal peace building are much more aggressively transformatory in their ambition, because earlier phases of neoliberalism under, to a certain extent, the Washington Consensus and the kind of neoconservative version of neoliberalism, we can get into that if you want, see an automaticity to the outcome. Whereas liberal peace building seeks deliberately to reconstitute a disciplinary state to cater for, they wouldn't put it like this, but it's the inference, to cater for the irrationality or the different rationality of the people that need to be disciplined underneath the rubric of that state. And I think that would be my answer. That both are equally ill-conceived, and I take your point very much that under the kind of exogenous neoliberal regime changes, there's a high point of violence to remove what's considered to be the blockage to universal outcomes, whereas liberal peace building is an extended form of recreating a disciplinary violent state to make sure that, and again, it gets back to make sure that the individual will be disciplined under a much more omnipresent form of institutional discipline.
So you can either have violence all in one go quickly or spread out over it.
Well, ironically, I mean, as I suspect we're going to find out in Syria pretty soon, if you violently remove a state, chances are that you'll be faced with a civil war as you were in Iraq. And of course, liberal people say, yes, of course, let's reconstitute the state. Let's leave these societies alone to make their own minds, which would make me probably a conservative in that sense, not a lefty.
Not a neoliberal.
Not a neoliberal.
Okay. So, but excellent. So we have Lisa, Tor, Roland.
Thank you very much for the talk. I suppose I have 2 points. One has to do with intentionality, which is something that is maybe I just didn't understand it very much. But you talked about rolling Afghanistan and Iraq into the liberal piece, and my question here would be, who's been doing the rolling? So, and again, when you talk about rejection of liberal peace building or shift away from neoliberalism, who's realizing this? You know, who's doing the rejecting? Is it the liberal peace builders, or is it the state builders, or is it the locals, or is it the scholarship? And the second point has to do with this unity, this generation view of the shifts. You know, you've identified neoliberalism and then liberal peace building, when in fact I'm not quite sure I agree with these quite clear-cut separation of generations, particularly when, if you were to take the generation approach, you do see that there are some instances of liberalist
liberal peace building that contain already fourth generation approaches, which is an attention to liberal peace building, and this goes as far back as the beginning of the liberal peace building attempt. And again, neoliberal peace building also had elements of hybridizing or localizing peace building and state building attempts even back in the beginning of the 90s. So yeah, that's the two questions: the intentionality and the generations.
Well, I have a three-part question with the small parts, and I should preface it by saying this isn't my field, nor is it my idiom, and so my question is symptomatic of that, but also risks perhaps not being a not particularly applicable question in your view, at least. But I understood you to link these shifts that we're seeing in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and liberal peace building more generally to a larger change in the nature of neoliberalism, or what David called its defeat. But certainly some a lack. It's no longer a lack of U.S. policymakers, for instance, no longer being enamored with it. But So first of all, first part, when I think of neoliberalism as a lawyer and a political economist, I think of it not in terms of neoliberal peace building, but in terms of particular, say, political economic policies, programs, etc. And so I wondered if you could say something in that regard in terms of Iraq, Afghanistan, because much of what you said to support this thesis was in terms of the security sectors in these countries and so on. Second part, when I think of it in these terms, I don't see neoliberalism being on the defensive, let alone defeated. I think if I look at this country, let alone Southern Europe right now, I see neoliberalism rampant. So what connections could you draw between peace building and neoliberalism more generally? And third, quickly, and risking contradicting myself, there are some scholars, David Harvey comes to mind, who have argued that neoliberalism shouldn't be seen as simply a collection of political economic policies or an ideology, but rather as a concrete class project to increase class power and advance sites of capital accumulation. And if we think of it in that term, in those terms, is there any contradiction necessarily between a strong state, at least in terms of its security apparatuses, and neoliberalism as a class project? Indeed, if we think of the stomping ground of neoliberalism in, say, Chile of the Pinochet era, or once again Southern Europe today, these are the most neoliberal countries are those with the biggest security states. So anyway, there you go.
Well, while you're pondering those Roland's.
Thank you. Just one question really about, you mentioned quite a lot about the sort of national subject and state, but not much about society. I just wonder if there was a shift in discourse of the nature of society within particularly sort of, weak, strong society, and if that, looking at the discourses, I'd just be interested. And the second one is just, I suppose it's, sometimes when you're talking about this, in the sense you said there's a sort of return to authoritarian state, or the neo-patrimonial state. This has been a massive sort of intrusion by an external state into Iraqi politics, and clearly there are obvious things in shift in sort of the certain professional groups having greater power than others, but to what extent has the deeper structures, the shadow state, been transformed or changed in this period? And if so, in what ways? Is the Iraqi state fundamentally different from the Saddam Hussein? In what ways has actually or is it's just a supervisory intervention which sort of failed then to really change anything in terms of the deeper structures, and the deeper structures just reasserted themselves?
Questions just keep coming better and better. So let's see how you fend off these ones.
Right. Intentionality. I think I would argue that the particular, both invasions, and especially the invasion of Iraq, was structured by a particular moment within a group of neoconservative thinkers. Now, neoconservatism has some very, very strong views on America's place in the world, on reducing the negative effects of modernity, on uniting the American population. It intriguingly has little or no understanding of how you would transform a rogue society, because that's not what it was about. Rogue state, if you use those terms. And so you find a series of neoconservative foreign policy advocates with no idea about state-society relations in terms of in terms of the role of the economy, whatever, and what they've done. And I think personified with Paul Wolfowitz, but Fife and all those key players, is simply take up a neoliberal view and reproduce it quite straightforwardly. My argument would be, when confronted with that, should we say, naive universalism, and confronted with the violent reaction behind that, they move to a much more standard or straightforward state-building project. That would be the intentionality there. That when confronted with liberated people fighting them, but we set you free and you're shooting us, they move to, they then adopt, and you see the Institute for State Effectiveness, RAND, these commercial deliverers of the whole of government approach coming into Iraq and giving them that. So to answer your question directly, the intentionality, they look for a series of problem solutions that, to a certain extent, RAND and those groups give them. I find that mirrored in the liberal, in the more academic end of the liberal peace building literature. You may disagree with me; I'm not an expert on it. I thought I'd defer to my chair's writings on that. Of course, it's hybridized. I don't think it was to begin with. I think the planning and initial execution around the invasion of Iraq is deliberately, and Afghanistan is deliberately rejecting liberal peace building, partly because of the shift from Clinton to Bush, but also partly because of it being the recreation of a muscular state was damned as being paternalistic and democratic, and that they come back to that when faced with the. So of course there's an interaction, but what do they pick up? They pick up a fairly, as far as I can understand it, a fairly coherent, programmatical approach to reconstituting state institutions that's out there, that's sold by the United Nations, and they go get it. They go get Brahimi, intriguingly. So they dump him pretty quickly when he tells them what they don't want to hear. So that would be my arguments there. Yeah, neoliberalism, David Harvey, and is it defeated? Right. On neoliberalism, yeah, I truncated what they did. I think you have in Afghanistan to a lesser extent, but also in Afghanistan, but massively in Iraq. When Bremer gets to Iraq, he wants to impose a flat tax, which is kind of radical even in an American situation. He then cuts corporation tax to a universal, I think 10%, wants to privatize everything and to international capital. And is stopped ironically from doing it by the mobilization of public opinion, wants to scrap all government subsidies, and is stopped again by his security advisor saying, you do that, we're going to be even worse in deeper problems. So there's a whole flat tax, privatization, the ending of the food ration, all these things are famously in the Emerald Palace book, the vast amounts of money set on creating a stock market, irrelevant. Against that background, is neoliberalism defeated? Well, it should be, shouldn't it? It's quite fascinating that neoliberal policies have driven the world economy into recession, and yet they still come. They're like kind of zombie ideologies. They keep coming back, partly because the alternative. I suppose you could argue that Obama was trying to to launch a kind of a kind of modified Keynesianism on a kind of logical reaction to the failure of neoliberalism. To some extent, the victory in the election may be a recognition that had some kind of plausible delivery. Yes, and God bless them, the German government are trying to impose neoliberalism on the whole of southern Europe to absolutely horrific social suffering. So no, it's not defeated, but it should be, and I don't quite know why it isn't. On Harvey and the class project, I mean, there's generational Harveys, as it were, and I find his later work, especially that little red book on neoliberalism, far too instrumental for my tastes. I would actually situate, if I'd have thought about it long enough and done the reading, the particular approaches of neoliberalism's adoption of neoconservatism in a kind of critical realist structure, which would which would link it to a particular form of capitalism and its ideational influences on the thinkers seeking to expand it. I wouldn't much. David Horrell probably used the term class in that structure. In that way, I'd link it much more to the evolution of particular brands of capitalism. Though to contradict myself in that, if you look at the class fraction that the neoconservatives are most aligned to and come from, it's a rentier class fraction within American capitalism. But I'll leave that there. And that answers yours, I guess. Roland, right. There's an interesting, Claret Bakari gave a really interesting paper at ABISA 5 years ago on the reorientalization of American perceptions after defeating Korea. I thought that's really interesting. I wonder, and this was in the midst of the defeat in Iraq, I wonder if it will go there. And it didn't, I don't think. There wasn't a kind of there wasn't a reorientalization. But there's a lot of really interesting work on counterinsurgency and how it seeks to divide society in a kind of essentialist way, in a way to fracture it and open it up and make and identify clever elites. I wrote a whole book on damning the deployment of notions of tribe in Iraq, and what does Petraeus do as soon as he arrives? Look, here are all these tribes, let's go do this. So it could be instrumental, but I suspect it's not. I suspect it's a way of re-envisioning society that makes it easier to fracture and identify forces you can bring in. So society was brought back in a very specific way. Of course, it was essentialized, but after that, it was then essentialized in a different way around tribalism. I don't quite know how to answer your second question. The conclusion, the conclusion that's implicit, I agree with. The Iraqi state now, it has a similar sized army, state, Mahabharat that is getting to grips with the society in a similar way. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable with the ramifications of saying that the Iraqi state collapsed 2003, 2006, and it was reconstituted in a very strange way and will now become a major rentier state, and the oil money will be massively more influential. Under Saddam, under the Baathists before 79, and under Saddam through the majority of the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq's civil institutions were much more omnipresent than they probably will be for another 20 years. So the state has been transformed, but the outcome looks very similar. But there's not enough electricity. The state's dreadful in delivering water, sewage, whatever. So the state's much weaker in certain senses, and it's not as despotically strong as it was under the Ba'ath at the pinnacle of their power. But it does look, in some instances, very similar. I suppose that would be the way to answer.
So I have a question, and there may be some more in the audience, but I guess what I want to ask you about is how the studies from the two case studies relate to the broader academic literature on liberal peace. Because you're sort of telling a narrative where liberal peace was rejected and we moved into a neo-liberal sort of...
I thought I said the opposite.
And then liberal peace came back again.
Okay.
No, in the 90s we had this liberal peace understanding. We rejected it. Then we had a neoliberal, let the market be the sphere of addiction. And you're sort of saying that today, what you call the liberal peace is now back in control. And you're sort of arguing that neoliberalism is pretty discredited, even though it still has its supporters. The economic recession, the sort of failure of Iraq and Afghanistan. You couldn't have much more of a failure than that. But in the literature, people are generally arguing that the liberal peace moment is past.
You are.
No.
And David Richmond, I guess.
Oliver Richmond.
Oliver Richmond.
No, but even policy documents don't say we need to exogenously build strong states. They sort of tend to argue that we need to facilitate people to do it themselves, that we need to have low horizons. Even at King's, you know, aged, not at all radical professors say the 90s was a hubristic moment of liberal peace, American unipolarity. We have to lower our expectations. How could we expect as exogenous actors to transform and build states? So it's, and all I'm thinking is there seems a bit of a disjunction, and that's why your confidence in this, the return of exogenous state building as the only alternative, seems peculiar, especially as we know that there is retreat and pulling out from Afghanistan and Iraq. So maybe, couldn't you argue that both what you call liberal peace and neoliberal...
I discredit it.
Yeah, and maybe some other framework is going on.
I would,
so,
yeah.
No, but because we're probably entering our last round of questions. So my question is just how it relates to that liberal peace literature, not the case studies. Is there any other questions? I thought I saw yes, sort of indicating a bit earlier, but maybe not. It's your last chance, folks. So unless you just want to ask Toby informally over a glass of wine, but why not share your question with all of us? Yes,
just
Elise.
very, very briefly. How is, maybe it's just me not being clear about this, but if neoliberalism belief in trade and market is jettisoned, like you mentioned, how does that differ, as Paul said before, from what we did in the 90s by saying that we can't do liberalization first because it doesn't work?
No.
And that's what led Paris to come up with the IBL strategies. How is that different from that?
Yes.
So I'm probably not able to frame it into a question, but sort of when you mentioned Syria and what we're going to see there, so my question, I mean, like, it's speculative, but what would your suspicion be? Because I the other day read this new report, the quadrennial report on diplomacy and development. So it has a few sections by the US and State Department. It has a huge section on state building and the importance of it. Has absolutely nothing to do. It does not mention the market or anything else. Doesn't mention the individual. It doesn't mention society. Doesn't mention any sort of goal. What needs, like, you know, what kind of institution would they need to be adapted to, and also says who needs to do it now from now on. This non-project are civilians. So absolutely, you know, there is no more muscular sort of doing state building that has no aim and B hasn't an actor anymore.
Final question, but look at it. Yeah.
Just a last musing on the notion of multilateralism, which was something the Bush government specifically rejected because of their belief in the power of American force. If that's been delegitimized as a result of this kind of muscular intervention, which has been proved not to have worked, what are the implications for the future uses of multilateral institutions, maybe the beefing up of them so they can become more muscular?
Okay.
In our book?
I'll start with Paris. My reading of Paris would be in this form that you need order before you need liberalism. You need state institutions. He wouldn't say this, but I would, that discipline populations before you then liberalise, which is, using it in a different term, as a kind of conservative and order first argument, which I would have thought is it may be a late liberal peace argument, but it's kind of perfectly in tune with my understanding of the evolution of that. And it goes to David's point about neoliberalism, liberal peace. If you, as you're quite right, that Afghanistan and Iraq were massive defeats on a spectacular scale, which caused much more suffering to the people subjected to them, to the people launching them, and that does draw back I mean, if you think RTP, liberal peace building, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, of course I deliberately and want to collapse them into the same discursive project, whereas people like Paris, CISC or whatever by now will be running down and hammering on the walls. And I think the constrained reaction to Syria is indicative of that. I don't think it'll last very long. I think that there are, and I was shocked and appalled by the intervention in Libya done in the same terms. If you're going to intervene in the least institutionalized state in the whole of the Middle East, you know, what have you learned from the losses or from the defeats you suffered before? So I think it comes back. I think it comes back as an ideational, instrumental solution to a series of problems that probably don't have solutions. What I find intriguing about Syria is it hasn't come back. Or we don't know what happened in the National Security Council meeting today in London, but I suspect even Cameron, who has smelt the whiff of cordite and glory in Libya, it's constrained enough to do that. You know, intriguingly, the French are less so. So I think, and I'll take your point, I don't think neoliberalism, sadly, has been defeated, and I still think it's a default hegemony, but it's not, its hubris has been constrained. You don't invade a country, remove its government, shrink its armed forces and walk away and say it'll all sort itself out. And I think that's where my reading, probably not yours, of liberal peace building comes from. That it's, oh no, and this is clearly in Paris, oh no, we need institutions, we need coercive structures to discipline and keep the population in order because the market and rationality won't do it. So in that sense, the kind of neoliberal extremism of the neoconservatives was an aberration. And order needs, and there's a recognition that order is both costly and needs to be constructed, which is why, in spite of the undoubted horrors unfolding in Syria, there is no great demand to intervene outside the New York Times editorials, I suspect. So expectations have been lowered, but I wonder for how long. That would be my point. On multilateralism, I think the neoconservatives have a very specific reading, you're right, of American power and the constraining effects of multilateralism. But I think that the liberal peace-building project is anchored deeply into multilateral institutions, which have also not got a great success rate in delivering it either. So I don't think multilateralism is in any way a solution. And I think a lot of the sins that I'm trying to identify were committed by multilateral organisations, and I think a lot of the hubris of the 90s was simply picked up and transmuted in the hands of American imperialism.
Brilliant. So, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience because it's very rare we get so many questions that are so good. And the reason for that is probably because it's very rare that we get such a brilliant speaker.